All right. Disclaimer. Next generation carriers and guests are individual union members speaking in a personal capacity, and they do not represent the views of the NALC, the United States Postal Service, or any other entity that is spoken on this program. If you enjoy our podcast, please subscribe to our monthly email newsletter. Go to nextgenerationcarriers.com/email. Fill in your name and email. Click subscribe. Also, if you would like to get in contact with Next Generation Carriers podcast, send us an email at nextgenerationcarriers@gmail.com. Today, we are joined by Joe Burns. Joe Burns is a labor organizer, labor leader, and a labor author. Joe, you want to introduce yourself?
Wait, let me see. All right. Hey, everybody. So my name's Joe Burns. I'm the general counsel, actually, of the Association of Flight Attendants. I've been a longtime bargainer in the airline industry, about 25 years of bargaining in the airline industry. And prior to that, I worked in various unions, including being a public employee, local union president prior to law school. And I'm the author. I've got 3 books that I'm going to discuss tonight to varying degrees. Reviving the Strike, which I wrote in 2011, arguing that the labor movement needs to refocus on regaining an effective strike. Strike Back, which is probably most on point for tonight, talking about the public employee strike wave of the 1960s and 70s, which is one of the great sort of examples of mass defiance and strike waves in U.S. history. And then Class Struggle Unionism, which is my most recent book. Anyway, so I'm glad to be here with y'all.
Cool. Thank you. We're also joined by Kristen Capone. Capone, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is James Capone. I'm president of Branch 764 in Dedham, Massachusetts. I've been carrying for 19 years.
And hi, I'm Chris Sampieri, carrier out of Branch 18. I've been a carrier for 8 years. I'm the legislative political director.
We're also joined by Margot O'Neill from Build a Fighting NALC. Do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yes, hello. My name is Margot O'Neill. I am a member of the coordinating committee for Build a Fighting NALC, and I am the chair of our very small chapter here in Des Moines, Iowa.
Before we go back to Joe, Margot, would you like to educate the folks that are new on what is Build a Fighting NALC and any upcoming events and how to get plugged in?
Yes, I would love to. A lot of you have probably heard of Build a Fighting NALC. We are pretty good friends with our great hosts of the Next Generation Carriers podcast, but I would love to introduce us. So we are developing Reform Caucus within the NALC. We are famous for the right for open bargaining and the Vote No campaign following the release of the contract, where we got a measly 1.3% raise. So to explore why these fights are so important, let's go back in time for a couple years. After almost 2 years without a contract, our coworkers began to wonder why we knew so little about what was happening at the negotiating table. Our answer to that was to put forward open bargaining resolutions that eventually passed at a national level, providing rank and file carriers more insight into what our leadership will be fighting for going forward. Once the contract was released and we got a historic 1.3% raise, we realized how critical it would have been for us to have had awareness of what our national leaders were fighting for. That's why we spearheaded the Vote No campaign. We took parking lot Vote No pictures, had break room meetings, brought coffee and donuts to talk to our coworkers about the campaign and how we deserved more. It took the NALC by storm when the sellout contract was voted down at a 70% margin. It was then sent to binding interest arbitration, tweaked slightly, and without having given carriers any final say, is now the rules that we work by. At BFN, we are against any process that dictates how we work that doesn't give carriers the final vote. We are for democracy in the workplace, and we are reforming the NALC from the ground up in that image. We believe that anyone who holds elected power must be held accountable. They always have to be pushed by a bottom-up movement. We are taking that up as our fight. We go on offense when the union plays defense. Our demands are a $30 an hour starting wage, full COLA, not a diet COLA, end to mandatory overtime, all career workforce, cutting top pay from 13 years to 6, a workers' wage for union officers, and a no to postal privatization. So you may have heard that the next contract negotiations are underway. Many of my coworkers have come up to ask me, how are we going to prevent what happened last time from happening again? How could we ever win a $30 an hour starting wage when we don't even have the final say on our contract? Is there an alternative to binding interest arbitration that could possibly win us what we need? I'm excited to announce that our Right to Strike campaign launch, which is happening Sunday, October 12th at noon Central Time, we are forcing the debate within the union to hold solidarity and support for the right to strike. Resolutions asserting the right to strike have already been passed at a few branches. Additionally, we will explore opportunities to work with other unions and build support within our communities and band together with our coworkers to fight for what we deserve in the upcoming contract. I'm going to invite my whole station, and I hope y'all will too. We are also putting together a working group to plan a contract rally for February 15th, which I'm excited for. These issues are obviously very intrinsically linked. And if you can't wait and want to start today, one thing that you can do is to make a difference in the union is to join or start a BFN chapter in your area. Can you find one other person who wants to change the union the way that you do? Can you each find one other person? This is where solidarity is built, and there are resources on fightingnalc.com.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, let's jump in. It's 8:10. As we currently sit here as postal workers, let's turn it back to Joe and let's talk about the 1970s postal strike if he wants.
There we go, unmuted. Hey, everybody. I'm going to talk about the 1970 strike, but I really think in order to properly understand it, we need to go back a ways and kind of talk about the public employee strike wave of the 1960s and kind of put it in context, because I don't think the 70 strike would have happened with postal workers if it hadn't been for this great upsurge of strike activity. In the 1950s and prior to that, public employees were weak, unions were weak, and a negligible part of the labor movement. In 1958, there were probably about, I think, 10 public employee strikes, and they were just real short strikes, and they were over more protests than real strikes over not being paid or some real local grievances. All of the public employee unions had in their constitutions prohibitions against striking. And in general, the union leadership didn't even agree with the idea that public employees should be allowed to strike. The policymakers, both Republicans and Democrats, had this idea that it was somehow impermissible for public workers to be able to strike because they were basically bargaining with the government. And they had all these sort of ideas that were hinged on that. Striking was and is a felony for federal employees, and every jurisdiction in the country had rules or laws against public employee strikes, making them illegal, and many times imposing harsh penalties such as termination or otherwise. Yet in the course of a mere decade, the landscape shifted. And during that period, millions and millions of public employees went out on strike, out on illegal strikes, defying injunctions in these sort of dramatic battles that really rivaled the great upsurges of the 1930s that we hear about, when the private sector labor movement was essentially reborn. And it really started with the New York teachers in 1960, who went out on an illegal minority strike where only 5% of the teachers went out. But then a couple years later, they did it again, timed it strategically right next to Election Day. And, through that, they won the right to collective bargain. So not only did they, win their immediate demands, but they were able to win collective bargaining and eventually, sort of spread that throughout the entire United States. One of the things that we learned from labor history is that solidarity builds upon solidarity. And that when workers see one group struggling and successfully struggling, they take those tactics and use it themselves. And that's certainly what happened with public workers in the 1960s. And what you see was the Chicago teachers who, prior to that, I think it rather than collective bargaining, you could really call the process collective begging. The union would show up to school board meetings, kind of plead their case about why they should get paid more. But at the end of the day, they would end up getting what the school board decided because they had no power, they had no leverage. And as we know from history, collective bargaining without the right to strike is not true collective bargaining. So following the New York teachers, guess what? The Chicago teachers showed up to the next school board session and the next bargaining sessions, and they said, screw it. If you don't agree to our demands, we're going to do what they did in New York. And they did. They have multiple strikes over the next 10 years, or else they settled right on the strike deadline. But over the 10-year period, they quadrupled their wages, and they won, more importantly, for many of them, a lot of improvements for students and all these things that got added to their contracts that we now call, bargaining for the common good or social unionism. But they were able to win their demands through militancy and collective bargaining. That lit a fire throughout the entire country, and in small communities and big communities in rural Oregon and Washington State. Teachers began striking all across the country. And we go from a situation where there were just a handful of strikes in the 1950s to I think at the height of it in the late 70s 574 public employee strikes across the United States, and these are strikes involving millions and millions of public workers. A lot of them really followed occupational groups. First, you had the teachers going, but then I think following them, you had other occupational groups like sanitation workers striking all across the country, even in the Deep South. And many of those strikes became fused with the civil rights movements and the urban rebellion of the 1960s. And through these battles, workers were able to not only win their immediate demands, but in almost every situation where they had militant strikes, they were able to win collective bargaining, and in many cases, the right to strike. So what you would see is like in Ohio or many other states, Minnesota, that you would have these sort of strikes that were rebellion. Here in Hawaii, you saw a similar process. 10,000 workers went out on strike. They surrounded the state capitol on an illegal strike while the state legislature was debating whether or not they should have the right to strike. Well, they already answered that with their feet. But so what we found is that pretty much everywhere, the response of policymakers ended up being either to, grant the right to strike or else to put in place collective bargaining procedures that certainly forced public employers to recognize the union and so forth. And, the end result of that was, by the 1970s, mid-1970s, 40% of public workers were in unions. Going from a, sort of handful to it. When I was a public worker, public employee president in the 1990s, I didn't know about our history. You always talked about, the legislature passed a law. That was really BS. And the real way it happened was through the power of the strike and public employees striking. I think they had and this, there's tons and tons of stories, and I collect them, some in my book, Strike Back, but in a lot of cities, it ended up like Baltimore or Philadelphia. You get all the different public workers going out on strike together, basically shutting down the city at the same time. And they became pretty major and dramatic confrontations. I think during this period, I think public employee unionists had a slogan that they used, which is there is no illegal strike, just an unsuccessful one. And what they meant by that was, the law can say that it's illegal, But if they had the correct strategy, if they were able to strike, if they had community support, if the times were correct, they could go out on strike and as part of the return to work, would have not have repercussions against them, despite what the letter of the law said. And I think we saw that more recently in the Red State revolts. If you remember back about 5 years ago down in, West Virginia, Arizona, I think it was Oklahoma, a lot of these real red states, teachers went out on strike statewide. Striking was illegal in all of these states, and the employers could have responded by trying to fire the striking workers. But I think one of the things that they discovered in the 1960s, the policymakers had a real problem, because if they had these big confrontations, they could try and fire all the workers, but what they often found is that just inflamed the struggle. Often the union members would take a subsequent vote to defy the injunction. And then it just made it harder to settle, because then you have all these fired workers, the employers or the governments would have to reverse themselves to make the dispute end. And, ultimately, in many or during that period, most situations were able to get a successful resolution. It's not like every strike won. I mean, there were some outliers. They were usually in more rural communities, usually where they didn't have a lot of labor support or political support, where the workers ended up being fired. You can say Minot, North Dakota. There's a couple, Hortonville and Illinois and stuff. So there were those cases, which I think you can find lessons from. But I think that is a key feature of the period. I'll say a couple of other things about the public employee strikes of the period and what we can learn from them today is one of the things we need to understand that a public employee strike is essentially a political strike, because and I'll set the postal worker strike of 1970 a little bit aside because I think it's a little bit different. But generally speaking, if you're striking, GE or UAW striking Boeing or the auto workers, what you're trying to do is you're trying to strike and you're trying to, ideally stop production at the employer so that the employer loses money, and that through the loss of money, the strikers are losing income. You're both able to eventually come to an agreement. That was a sort of classic theory. The difference that I think analysts understood was that with many public employee strikes, the employer actually saves money. So it's a little bit of a different situation. Let's say you go on strike at a library. Well, guess what? They don't stop collecting taxes, right? The employer is actually saving money during that strike. But what kind of generates the ability for the strike to settle is sort of the community pressure, the support that the strikers get to pressure the policymakers eventually to come to a settlement. So I think when you're thinking about strategy, that's important. So when you kind of piece this all together, I think by the time you get to the late 60s and 1970s, we have this sort of long history of public employee strikes and striking of illegal strikes. So when you get to the postal strike of 1970, it fit within a context of things already happening. It was tied into the social movements of the 1960s. A lot of these strikes had the era of rebellion about it because it was part of the 60s and the social movements, a lot of young workers involved in them. So you end up, having like many of the strikes of the period, you have it being led by the grassroots rather than from the top. Certainly that was the case here, where it starts out of the New York locals and spreads across the country by workers walking out and local leaders walking out. But eventually the union as a whole embracing it. And I think that's what you really saw, I think throughout the 1960s was the sort of militants in all of these unions were really fighting a two-front battle. They were fighting, the employers by pushing the right to strike in the government. but they were also showing up at their union conventions, and if you read the sort of accounts of the period, almost every union, you had these battles at the conventions, AFSCME and the teachers unions about removing the sort of ideas in the unions that prohibited workers from engaging in illegal strikes. And they were pretty much successful in sort of removing those prohibitions and changing the attitudes of the national union leaders about the right to strike. So I think that's sort of, one of some of the lessons of the period. I think some of the questions that were sort of embedded, I think, in the outline that I was given, sort of look like, how do we compare that to today and so forth. So I think you do have to talk about also what happened with public employee strikes and the strike wave of the 1960s and 70s. And I think what you see is that, through the 1960s and well into the 1970s, you have public employees striking at fairly high rates. But you also see the institutionalization of collective bargaining. So you guys see that with the postal workers, where one of the outcomes of your strike was you become the only group of federal workers to be able to bargain over wages. So most of the other federal workers can bargain, but they're not bargaining over wages. You get the arbitration put in there as opposed to the right to strike. But we also see that in New York State and some of the other states as well. As a sort of parentheses around that point, when labor scholars studied it in the 1980s and 90s, they kind of looked at, well, what did the law did it really impact strike levels? Because you can look across 50 different states, you can look across the period of time before striking was outlawed and when it wasn't, whether they put in, arbitration and stuff. And interestingly, they found that workers were striking at higher levels when the right to strike was prohibited than when it wasn't, because what happened was employers really wouldn't engage in collective bargaining and the workers would go out on strike anyway. So you ended up on a strike, and once they sort of instituted these procedures, it actually tended to lower the strike numbers. One of the problems you have, anytime this instance is a little hard not to, the government's your employer, but anytime the government starts getting involved in bargaining, as they start instituting rules and trying to restrict and constrain bargaining, they give you the right to bargain, but then pretty soon they start limiting the subjects that you can bargain, like the Chicago teachers face that. So you can't bargain over class size and all these sort of ideas, which are contrary to what workers actually want to do, start getting imposed. But just to, fast forward the story a little bit, you get to the mid 1970s, and what you find is that a lot of, I think, these, Democratic politicians and others start deciding that there's a future to be gained in standing up to and taking on public employee unions. And you start seeing the difficult, I see a couple of my old friends on here. I'll have to say hi later. But you start seeing a real sort of crackdown on public employee strikes and a more willingness to try and confront them. So I'll take a couple examples. Whereas sanitation workers are able to strike at the height of the civil rights movement in Atlanta, in '69, and successfully carry out a strike, and a lot of the Black establishment supporting them at the time. By the time you get to the 1976, there's a shift, and they end up, the business community and the leadership of the city government at the time ends up turning on the strikers and firing them, and the conditions are a lot different. So I think one of the lessons you have to learn is, you have to be cognizant or think of the changing conditions. I think that's certainly the case when you get to the PATCO strike in 1980. which I encourage everyone, if you really want to dive deep into the subject, beyond my book Strike Back, to look at Joe McCartan's book on the PATCO strike, which I think is an excellent, not only for describing the actual strike, but sort of the 20-year battle that air traffic controllers had to build a militant union leading up to the strike. But it also shows that you can't just reflexively say that you can strike in every situation. You have to have an understanding of the sort of political forces that you're up against, what are the politics and so forth. Because if you don't do that, you can certainly end up, flat-footed. I'll, I think a couple other things, just about the 1970 strike, just a couple other observations, and I know some folks on here probably know more than me about it. But I think that, the 1970 strike was interesting because I think the Postal Service played a different role in 1970s than a lot of other public service or public workers played, and that they had a lot more power, not just in terms of politics, but in terms of the impact of stopping production on the national economy. When you look back in 1970s, that's before we have email, before we have really the rise of widespread rise of UPS and FedEx and all these other alternatives. So the sort of ability back then to wage a successful strike and really impact the workings of the national economy was pretty high. And that way, I think, even differentiates it from other public employee strikes of the 1970s, where I talked about them, a lot of them, mainly being political. I think this one had a sort of mixed impact. And I think you would have to, in any sort of discussion of today, kind of update that analysis and see, what has changed and what hasn't. Those are some of the comments that I would have on the postal strike and the sort of strike wave of the 1970s. I think just to kind of wind up past there, I think once you get the PATCO strike of the 1980, you go into a period where you see the real virtual decline of the public employee strike as a major tactic for public employee unions. I mean, there were some strikes through the 80s and 90s, but I tended to follow the overall decline of strike activity a little bit more dramatically, I think, then. But that happened in the private sector in the 90s and beyond. So by the time you get to sort of, the 2010 era, a lot of folks had abandoned the strike. And I think that's why the Chicago teachers strikes end up being an important watershed in public employee unionism, because I think it was really reclaiming the idea of the strike and the right to strike for public workers and putting it back on the agenda for public workers and for workers in general, and sort of leads to a sort of history of teacher unionism strikes, including but not limited to the red state teachers revolts, but also strikes in a lot of blue states as well. At this point, I am going to move. I've been asked to speak a little bit about class struggle unionism, which is a bit of a shift, if that's what you guys want. Let me just take a little pause here. So my first two books, Reviving the Strike, was really on this idea that striking is essential to collective bargaining and we need to restore it for private sector workers mainly, but also public. My second book, Strike Back, really focused on what I've been talking about here, the sort of public employee strikes. How did they do it? Kind of weaves in a theme about how were they able to violate labor law? I mean, how was it that millions of workers were able to go out on illegal strikes and survive? And but all of those kind of focused on sort of the tactic of striking. My latest book is called Class Struggle Unionism, which came out a couple of years ago. And there I kind of take a little bit different tack, because here my focus is more on our forms of unionism. And I take a look at the labor movement, and I basically analyze the labor movement based on, what are all my books. I like to look back at history and I like to apply it to the present. I like to take the sort of lessons that we can learn, not just because I like studying labor history, but I think we can learn a lot and we have an outside lens of applying it to today's struggles. So in Class Struggle Unionism, I look back and I say, what is one of our problems? And frankly, one of our problems that we face in the labor movement is not just the employers, but it is our very own unions, who often do not fight enough. They're not militant enough. They're not member-led enough, and they're really not up to the tasks of today. And what I do is I look at historically the two main ways of doing unionism were one that I call class struggle unionism, and the other called business unionism. And class struggle unionism was a unionism that didn't just look at sort of narrow bargaining with their employers. I think they understood the class struggle unionists, and by the examples, you can look at the industrial workers of the world in the early 1900s, Eugene Debs, who was a great socialist leader, but prior to that, great leader of the railroad workers, and broke off to do the 1895 rail strike, and a lot of the socialists and so forth who did really made possible the strikes of the 1930s and beyond. And they had a vision of unionism that was a lot broader. I think they understood that our unionism is part and part of a struggle against the billionaire class in society. And I think they understood that the source of power and wealth in society comes from the workplace, and that, in workplaces all across the country, workers produce the wealth. Workers, whether you're a Starbucks worker, whether you're an auto worker, whether you're a nurse, whether you're a postal worker, what you all share in common is that you during the course of your work shift, you take whatever is given you, the raw materials or the services or whatever inputs that you have, and you make it more valuable by your labor throughout the course of your work shift. But the problem is that value, you only get back a fraction of it in the form of wages, but the rest of it flows forward, and it flows up and up in society to the billionaires. And that is exactly why and exactly how we have billionaires in society. So I think a class struggle unionist will tell you, how can we possibly have unionism when we don't take into account that our very labor is the one that's creating these billionaires? Because one of the problems is you can negotiate, like the auto workers and the mine workers. They negotiated great contracts in the 40s and 50s and 60s, the great heyday of unionism. But employers were also, extracting, value from them and profit, and becoming more and more powerful. And you have the rise of these billionaires. And what did the billionaires do with all their ill-gotten gains? They used it to turn on the workers, right? To undermine, to buy the Supreme Court, to undermine unionism. They use it to go against, set up these think tanks, to go against postal workers and other public workers, and undermine the very, foundations of our unionism. So, I think a class struggle unionist would say, how on earth can we have a unionism that doesn't fight against and take on these billionaires at the very same time that we're fighting for our contracts and our unionism? A class struggle unionist will also say that we need to fight for broad class demands, that we're part of a broader working class, and we can't have this sort of narrow unionism where we're only trying to take care of ourselves, because that will come to, well, not only is it wrong, but it will come back to bite us in our asses, because what we'll find is that the employers will isolate us and use it against us. So the class struggle unionists had some of the greatest forms of unionism in history. In contrast, and I think this is really the most prevalent form of even today in our unions, is we have these sort of narrow bureaucratic business unionisms, often led by do-nothing bureaucrats who are isolated from the members and don't really, they haven't worked in the workplace for years and years. And met some unions, they've never worked in the workplace, right? So how could they possibly experience or know what the workers are going through? So they end up having this sort of form of unionism where they're considered to be the experts, where, the sort of bargaining was held like closely guarded state secrets, where the members couldn't possibly be told what's happening in bargaining because they would be so confused because they're so, there were all these sort of antiquated ideas. I know you talked about open bargaining, but that was the opposite of open bargaining, this idea that you couldn't trust the members. And and the sort of reliance on government procedures and so forth. So, and this sort of narrow unionism that took care of their particular members. When you think about the building trades or a lot of the construction unions at various times, they'll sell their soul to build a Walmart store, but they won't really worry about the workers who are going to have to work there after them. So that's really kind of the business unionism. So you can see you have, on one hand, class struggle unionism, which is based on these sort of class-wide demands on workers' controls, on believing in the workers. And then you have this bureaucratic business unionism. There's sort of a third type that I talk about. I don't know how much it's prevalent, with you all. But in the 1980s and 90s, there was this kind of third trend that developed that I call labor liberalism, which was, they say neither fish nor fowl. It was, it tried to straddle the line between class struggle unionism and business unionism. It got rid of some of the worst parts of business unionism, like, better positions on immigrant rights and a lot of social issues, and got rid of a lot of the, frankly, racist sort of ideas that a lot of the AFL unions had in the 1970s and 80s even. But it didn't really break with business unionism, and it didn't really break with the sort of staff control and the sort of idea that the staff are the experts and so forth. So ultimately, it did not prove to be as much of an alternative as it claimed. So that's why, I argue for a return to good old fashioned class struggle unionism. I think that is important for us moving forward, that we really, we need, if you study enough labor history and I think enough current battles, I think what you'll discover is that, I don't know if it's unfortunately, it's just a reality that in most of the struggles, if you're hearing the story of it, the battle within the union is as important as the battle with the employers, because you have often have a basic divide between those who want to fight and those who don't, those who want to listen to the membership and those who don't. Often because their material interest or their way of life is different from that. So for that reason, it becomes a key issue that we have to face. I'm going to say a couple words. I think the last part was on the current situation. I'm going to say a little bit on that, but then I think, it's probably best to go to discussion, which I favor and I think is best. But, obviously we're in a difficult situation today. We have the rise of, sort of the real anti-union forces and attacks on federal workers and public employment in general. And really a political climate where it's moving towards fascism and openly fascist ideas. So I think one of the questions that we have to have is, is our labor movement up to the task of confronting this? And what are we going to do as those who, favor a fighting militant democratic labor movement to change that? I think the answer to the first question, at least in my mind, is fairly clear. That I think across the board within the labor movement, we have not seen the sort of response that the day requires. I think that's across the board. I think the attacks on the federal workers and federal unions have been the response has been relatively muted. And you see people mainly trying to rely on lawsuits and sort of ducking their heads and hoping it will all be over. It's not going to all be over. And our only hope is going to be to fight our way out of this. We have a section of the labor movement. I think you can look at the Teamsters and Sean O'Brien, but you can also look at who initially held some promise. But it was, I don't think quite real. You have a section of the labor movement that's decided the path forward is to cozy up to Trump and the Republicans and think that they can appease their way out of it. I think history shows that is not a worthwhile path. And then I think you have a lot of confusion out there in the labor movement about what's the steps. I think the most fruitful trends that we have are going to be like always coming from the rank and file. It's going to be coming from groups like you all. It's going to be coming from I think we're seeing reform movements develop in a lot of different unions today, the UFCW, AFSCME, and so forth. Certainly the teachers have had it for a while. And I think it's going to be a return to this, sort of member-led grassroots unionism, because I think what we find is that, if you're able to organize, I will say, I'm writing my fourth, maybe, I don't know, my final book, but my fourth book is on class struggle organizing, and it's going to focus on a lot of the tactics and sort of strategies of organizing and theories and stuff. But, I think, I always say believe in the workers, and they'll always be there when it matters. And that's been my experience across the decades. And I think, I think groups that, sort of put out bold demands that are clear and honest to the members that can kind of help fashion a path forward, will do well in this period. Because, I think, one of the things that we know is that class struggle comes from the workplace. It doesn't come from like someone's idea or coming from a book, or it doesn't come because some organizer dreams it up. It comes because postal workers or nurses or teachers or whoever are feeling the boots to their neck, and they're feeling the need to fight back. So I think to the extent you all can keep up what you're doing and redouble your efforts, I think it will pay off. Beyond that, I'm sort of interested. I can cover any other topics you want, but I think it's probably best to have some questions, or John and y'all, if you want to engage in a discussion, that'd be good.
Thank you. In chapter 4 of Class Struggle Unionism, you write, in 2016, the labor movement spent an estimated $167 million on the elections, along with an incredible amount of time and effort of staff and members. Despite this incredible outlay of cash, labor unions were outspent by just 5 billionaires. Tom Stever, or Tom Sawyer, Sheldon Elderson, Donald Sussman, Fred something, and Dustin thing. Currently in the NALC, we're very big on donating to the PAC fund, and they're very big on saying the historic 1970 strike was great. Currently, as we were just saying, the attack on the federal unions is a big threat to all labor unions, and postal workers are federal workers. So what do you have to say to the union bureaucracy when it says just donate $5 and sit down?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the bigger point in that book was that, simply, any strategy that's for labor revival that's going to be based on electing Democrats or electing different politicians is not going to be fruitful. And ultimately, one, we're going to be outspent, and two, as Tony Mazzocchi said, in the great leader of the OCA, the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, and the leader of the trying to found the Labor Party in the mid 1990s, said, the bosses have two parties. It's time for workers to have one. And I think the idea is that we really, can't revive ourselves or even defend ourselves just based on that. And we also need to understand that the attack on public workers has been a bipartisan attack. I know in the worst of times we have the idea, and especially a lot of the union leaders want to run back into the arms of the Democrats, but we need to understand that sort of the precursor to the attack on federal employees now was, sort of in the 90s, Al Gore's Reinventing Government, which, lost 400,000 federal worker jobs. So I just think, and if you look at a lot of the strikes of the 1960s and 70s and sort of those battles in these cities where they weren't, it wasn't Republicans running the governments of those cities, by and large. The confrontation was with Democratic mayors in the 60s and beyond. So I think we just have to be a little clear-headed about it.
Now, one of the things about the PAC fund, specifically our letter carrier political fund, you do have to admit there is a little bit of a difference in regards to that the government actually sets our rates. So having a PAC fund where we can have and get out to the legislators and talk to them, because we're directly influenced by the government comparative to other unions who are not being set with rules by the government. They decide how much our stamps are. They decide the protection we get through our own police force, which, we have a letter carrier bill right now to protect us, that we are more in line with dealing with the government than most unions are in regards to every step of the way. And the PAC fund supporting politicians who support our bills, in my opinion, is a very important issue.
Yeah, look at I was involved in AFSCME in the 90s and public employees with the nurses and stuff. So I've done a fair bit. I'm not making a general point that people shouldn't donate to PACs or that it has no utility. I think there's a lot of issues where you're going to be engaging with the government, and that's your employer, and those donations and that sort of political club matters. I think that you look at the Chicago teachers, they're heavily involved in the politics in Chicago. Got one of their former members and staffers elected as mayor. So I think they've seen that, and that's one of the progressive militant unions, and have seen the sort of political component of what they do to be important. So I think that's the case. I think what the problem that we saw was in the 1980s and 90s and beyond. We saw the virtual disappearance of the strike, and everything went into lobbying, and it became mainly about that. And I don't think that sort of model fared well for the public employee unions, because eventually the politicians just started to take them for granted. And I think it wasn't until the unions, like the teachers unions in LA and Chicago, started to break out of that mold. And I'm sure LA is still really involved in politics and stuff, but they did it in a little bit more of an independent way, and it was coupled with the sort of worker self-activity. So I think that's the key to it. And you
They
guys know
also
better.
push candidates, though, don't they?
Yeah.
I mean, we
yeah.
don't push candidates because we are supposed to be more, by the Hatch Act, when you'll see the
Yeah.
teachers out there specifically pushing candidates where they can get the candidate support by pushing them. We can't go out in uniform and hold signs saying we're supporting this candidate as letter carriers.
Yeah. No, so that's certainly a big difference, and if you compare it. So, I think the general point here is, if your only strategy is to rely on PAC donations and so forth, then you don't have a real strategy. Can it fit within an overall strategy? I think the answer is yes. That there's always going to be a political component to it.
Yeah. Before we move over to Chris, the teachers, their slogan is the teachers' working conditions are the students' learning conditions. So they don't solely just rely on PAC money. They build it into a broader strategy and campaign, and that's something that's kind of void of the NALC and maybe the rest of the postal unions. But it's something that we can't abandon the PAC, but we need to have that as a strategy with something else. So I'm going to pass this over to Chris.
Yeah, if I could just piggyback too on John's thing as well, the letter carrier political fund should be secondary. Like it's much like when people like, I don't like company X for whatever reason. I'm going to boycott them. Well, great. But if there was a strike going on at company X and you want to support them, then the boycott's secondary. I view the LCPF the same way. If there is a strike, that's what we do. We're like our union right now. We have the state associations right now in 49 states. Sorry, Alaska, but we exist there. And to my knowledge, we have not organized a single rally outside of a politician's office who is not supporting us. Capone mentioned there's 3 bills going in Congress. One is the most important one, I think, is the Protect Our Letter Carriers Act, because we're getting robbed at gunpoint for our arrow keys. The word on this, criminals are realizing they're worth a lot of money. So you can see videos of it on YouTube. That's happening more often, and we want to phase these out. I live in Massachusetts, it's all Democrats in there, and not all of them support it. And our state association is not putting any pressure at all, to my knowledge, at all. And other states, like in South Carolina with Nancy Mace, who's trying to end off dues checkoff, there are no protests that were being organized by the State Association of South Carolina to be protesting Nancy Mace, how she's attacking us. But I'm going to go back to just that whole thing about the situation politically for us. And I'll get to this, I swear. 2006, you have the Postal Accountability Act, which starts that pre-funding mandate, which starts bankrupting that's all of the losses, in like 95% of them were from this whole law. And that, now we can say, oh, look, see, the Republicans are attacking us. But Obama, when he got it, he had a majority in the government to overturn it. But what did he do? And you can Google it. He wanted to do austerity cuts. He didn't want to help us. We were losing a lot of money. And he's like, well, let's end Saturday delivery, which is austerity. That's not helping the situation. Trump comes in, not a friend of the letter carrier, sorry, because he proposed privatization. And during COVID, when we're risking our lives delivering to people, when everyone was shut in, he threatened, he didn't give us a bail. Everyone else got bailout, Shake Shack, all the corporations got all the free money. We got a loan with conditions on it. And right now, when it comes to politically too, if you look at, I think it was WikiLeaks put it out, but the head of the Democratic Party even said about responding to the AFL-CIO, our parent union. They even said, look, they got nowhere else to go. Organized labor is nowhere. Where are they going to go? They're going to have to vote for us or not. It's a dead end. They're not going anywhere. Now, you brought up Tony Mazzocchi, so you already kind of beat me to it. So you might know where this is going. But for those of you who don't know, Tony Mazzocchi, after NAFTA, which was Bill Clinton and the Democrats played a part in this, they were going to destroy manufacturing unions in the Midwest from what they were proposing with NAFTA. The Labor Party, it was a movement for a Labor Party. He was a great leader. Unfortunately, he died and the party died with him. But do you think it's time that unions should stop spending money on Democrats and Republicans? And do you think a Labor Party is needed, or Workers' Party, whatever you want to call it? But do you think that's something that Labor should, do you think we should be pursuing that?
So here's the problem, and I think it's a problem that they faced in the 90s, was that in order to have a labor party, you'd need to have a, good solid labor movement to anchor it, and I think there were too few unions that were class struggle unions back then, to really make it happen. And I think support it. I think it's, obviously what we need. But I think, my focus, is, in rebuilding a class struggle trend in the labor movement. And I think what we've learned from history is that, the moves towards the Labor Party, get strongest when there's the workers in motion, and that there's when there's a upsurge. And I think we saw that in the 1930s, with sort of the delegates to the conventions and their views on the Labor Party. It's something that happens and develops through class struggle. So I think, I think eventually, but I think if we tried to start it now, I don't think it'd go anywhere.
Cool. Thank you. I guess we could open the floor and have Jamie. Jamie, come on in.
Oh,
Introduce yourself.
Right.
Hey, Jamie.
Sorry, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Cool. Jamie Partridge, retired letter carrier, Portland, and a member of Rank and File Caucus, BFN Build Fighting NALC chapter in Portland. My question is for the BFN coordinating committee people here. Margot, who else? Ernest, Chris, Virgilio, are you part of this? Anyway, so and I hope you will also, do a little deep dive into the kickoff with the right to strike and contract campaign on the 8th, what is it? The 12th of October. I think it's great that we're having this conversation about striking and, having a deep dive, which has not happened in the 40 years I've been in this union, really people talking about seriously, how could we make it happen? And of course we, when we talk with the Canadians about how they got the right to strike, it wasn't through legislation, baby. It was by striking, right? It's the same way that as Joe suggests, you win the right to strike by striking. And so when we talk about getting the right to strike, what is the process? Is it lobbying Congress? But more importantly, the question I have is, are we trying to change the position of our national union on the right to strike? Because if you look at the official positions of the NALC, the right to strike has been passed at the 47th convention, the 48th convention, the 49th convention. Delete the no strike article at the 49th convention. I mean, we have amnesty for striking the 48th convention. So, I mean, we've taken this position over and over and over that we want the right to strike. So anyway, just want to, throw that in there about what do we see as the process to get there?
Thank you. Something that Build a Fighting NALC and every like-minded individual of the postal unions need to digest. I don't think there's a straight answer from one individual. Steve Brown, want to introduce yourself and ask your question? Oh, sorry, I got to unmute you. There you go.
I'm a retired mail handler. And my question to Joe is, what do you think can be done about the extremely low interest in the union or participation by the rank and file? Obviously, no one in a certain sense, no one in their right mind who's working all day wants to go to some boring union meeting, but it's a kind of a perpetual problem, how to get people involved in taking power for themselves.
That's a interesting question, and actually one I've been thinking a lot about lately because I've been kind of thinking about organizing and so forth. And I think I was just writing a subchapter on apathy, and a lot of the union writers like to talk about it in terms of kind of getting members to move past apathy. And I always think that that's a wrong point of view because I don't think like looking at it whether or not the members are apathetic it is the right point of view. My experience and what I always say is that the workers will show up when it matters. And that's certainly been my experience. And to the extent that they don't show up to some union meeting, if it's a boring union meeting, maybe it's not irrational for them not to show up, or if it's some performative picket or door knocking or whatever it is, they're not showing up. But that's not really an indicator that they don't care or won't care or can't care or won't be there for a different sort of circumstances. And I think when you look at the sort of strikes that develop, it's not this sort of process that a lot of the books talk about it, about being the sort of one person talks to one person and they start engaging in some, actions and so forth. They tend to be more these explosive affairs where the workers in general just kind of get together, and sometimes it comes out of the woodwork. I would imagine before the 1970 strike, many might have said that the workers don't show to union meetings, or they don't, care, or they don't go to it. But the fact is, they did care, and they came forward once there was like a real plan and something that made sense to them, and then they jumped on it. I think what we're seeing I was just looking up some of the strikes that were happening in production and over the last few years, like Mack trucks in Virginia and some of the Boeing strikes and stuff. And a lot of those came out of the blue where, the union negotiated a tentative agreement and it gets voted down 96, 99%. The workers go out on strike, and in many situations they're getting new tentative agreements, they're staying out on strike, and they're still voting it down. So I think, I think in those situations they did care, but it was just a set of circumstances that would come up. Certainly when I'm doing bargaining, which is what I've been doing for the last couple decades, we'll have some pretty quiet workplaces. But when you go in there with some demands and some sort of plan, I find that the members are thirsting for it. At least that's always been my experience. It may not be a universal truth, but I would say that people, they're the ones who are feeling the same thing that you all are, or that of. So I think we just have to operate on the basis that they will step up, and I've never been disappointed. I'll say that. I'll tell people we get our 99% strike votes, we get even quiet workplaces. Once people get on fire, they get on fire. So that's where I draw hope from.
Thank you.
Also, if I can piggyback too on that, I think, for us in the letter carrier union, when the tentative agreement came out, it was so bad. Some of us thought it was fake. It was leaked, and I'm like, it cannot seriously be this bad. And so when we all realized it wasn't fake, 1.3% raises every year, after waiting 600 days for a contract. I think my opinion, and a lot of people, our last TA was 100% a concession to management. We got nothing out of this last deal at all. And then we voted it down 71% vote, which hasn't happened in 50 years. Not since 1978.
No, we usually get 17%, which, not to jump on, we're talking about apathy. Isn't that a key of apathy? If only 17% is voting on national elections and contracts,
They're not voting. It's probably because they think it doesn't matter. Like, so when people don't do something, I assume that they think it doesn't matter, and
because they're not going to meetings to hear how important it matters.
Yeah, but sometimes my only point here is that if people are saying it don't matter, we can say, well, they're wrong about it, or we can figure out what does matter to them. So obviously voting on a contract that they didn't like, that mattered for them because they were willing to come out and do that. We've seen many situations where people aren't engaged in the union. But when it comes to striking, they go from 0 to 60. So I think it's really, I think in terms of our theories of organizing, we just need to kind of understand that and this is tracks my experience is that people got a lot of demands on their time and their energy and stuff. And if they're not excited about something or they're not getting engaged, it's not really their fault. It's, maybe it's their fault. You can say, well, they should care. But if they're not caring, then what is it that they do care about? And what is it that's going to get them into action? And a lot of times, I got all these slogans, which forgive me, but one of my other slogans is, if you think the workers aren't behind you, look ahead, because that's probably where they are. They're probably looking for a lot more than what they're being offered.
But how is anything going to change if the meetings are boring and they're not giving information and there's apathy of the members? If the members aren't going to the meetings, then how are they going to run to change to how they want it to be? So I run a branch. My meetings are very informative. Any member that goes to it, I still don't get 100%. It's not because of boredom. At that point, it's apathy, that people that don't want to get involved. And we do everything. We bring in speakers. We do everything. Some people are not getting involved. But if you have tons of people not showing up because the meeting is boring, how are they going to get involved to run for a position to change that and get members affected? It's a very quitting mentality of, well, it's boring, I'm not going to go, I'm not going to change anything. We should be pushing and advocating for people to change their unions from inside to build up.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. My experience when I was doing union local leader was a lot of people wouldn't come to meetings, but if I said we had some big fight going down or we had some vote coming up, then they'd show up to the meeting because they did care about what was happening. And, we'd get 100 people come to the meetings because they wanted to, they cared about the policy. So I can't speak to, particulars, but I can say, sort of as a, theory of organizing, I think to the extent that we people will show up. It just may not be over the things that we want them to,
Yeah.
but it doesn't mean that they won't.
Yep. And last thing too, just to clarify what I said earlier, because I think there was a miscommunication. We had so that vote was 71 voted no, and we had a turnout of 90,000 people. The election, I think itself for our president, I think only got 30,000 votes, so literally 3 times the amount turned out. We had a very large amount turnout, and then 70, like I said, that's the highest amount we've had as far as a very long time. Because people were angry, and I think, I mean, if you can look at one of our sister unions, the rural carriers, a different union, they also had a T, and only 14,000 bothered to vote. Like that is a very low amount for them. So we did far better. I think we have more communication. We have this really great podcast, but I think it's just the fact that people were pissed off enough to get involved and vote because people who told me I haven't voted in a union, any of these TAs in 20 years. I've never voted, but this time around, people were angry, and that was promising. The problem is this contract was then jammed down our throat by our president. There's a lot of theories about how it took only 3 days to figure out this contract. But yeah, so I think like I said, if there's something that people care enough about, I won't say anything about my branch meetings. They're not, sometimes they're not that exciting. But I know other people in smaller branches have very good meetings, and they're not all created equally. But I just wanted to add in my 2 cents there. So thank you for that. Next, I see Vahio on stack, and then Vicky. I'll unmute you.
Good evening. Thank you, Joe, for coming to this podcast. This is very, very illuminating for a lot of we're here in Seattle. We're doing, book readings of your latest book, Classical Unionism. And I would like to ask, we're in the NALC, the postal unions. We're in a very unique space in the federal government. Like you can see the ease by which this administration was able to overturn or repeal a lot of national agreements in the federal sector. But, due to the strike in the 70s, we have private sector rights through the NLRB, where you directly negotiate with the United States Postal Service for our wages, hours, and working conditions. Due to this unique space, what do you think is the role of the postal unions as a federal union, in support for, the struggle for federal unionists, right? Like people here were asking, well, what are we focusing on the right to strike in DFN? Because it's hard to see like what would be a rallying issue, right? Like as in general for rank and file members moving forward, other than the right to strike, because you see the limits of the supposed positives of interest arbitration that we're stuck with as a public sector union in the federal workspace. Like, I mean, yes, it has great positive in that we'll actually have a contract in the end, but as we can see, like the membership can vote a tentative agreement down 71 to 29 and still have interest arbitration imposed on us. And Joe, like it's really hard too. Like even if we did have the right to strike, you could see like the problems with that in the Canadian postal system, where their federal government can just impose legislation to send them back to work, like the rail workers were here in the United States. Like even with the strike weapon in the public sector, like as you said, it's a politics, but it's a political strike, right? Like you have to get the public in support of you, but at the same time, it's very hard. It's moving forward. Just with the class struggle basis, like what space do you think like the postal unions have like moving forward? This is because this administration is going to fire us if we go on strike on a wildcat again. We're not as strong as we were in the 70s, I would argue. But what do you think is the path forward for postal unions if you're given the unique space that we're in?
Yeah, I mean, I can just say a couple words that you guys know, obviously better than me. You all are living it and doing it as your work. I think, I think you're correct. I mean, I write about the right to strike and the role of the strike, but it's something that is time, place, and conditions in terms of its effectiveness or its utility and so forth. So I think I think just a couple of points is that I think the the particular is part of a general is part of a particular. So I think here what's going on with the postal workers is part of a broader fight that's going on with federal workers, which is part of a broader fight in society. And to the extent that, there is or needs to be a battle, sort of to defend public service and to defend the very federal government and the services that are provided. So I know that there's some rank and file initiatives in a lot of the federal unions. I forget what it's called, Federal Workers Network, and to try and get some of that stuff going. But yeah, I think it's what you raise are, some of the difficulties. What's going to animate your members? What's going to get them to step forward? I think that's something I certainly can't answer. I think it's a question of, what are they feeling? What are what are they concerned about? It seems like a lot of the talk is about the contract and sort of the immediate demands. To what extent are people worried about the future of the postal service or fighting for that? Then I guess you'd have to kind of figure that out as well.
Also, I have a question from one of my coworkers. We were out tabling at SNDC on Amazon Sunday. So he can't make it, but this is what he asked me. He texted me this question. This is from Reed Wilder at Branch 34. In Strike Back, you talk about work to rule slowdowns. This seems like an effective tactic for the NALC since the union already encourages workers to slow down their pace and do the job the right way. Could you go into the legality of work to rule slowdowns and maybe what you see as strengths and weaknesses?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in terms of anything that's work to rule or slowdowns, the strength of it is depending on the industry, it really varies. You can impact the production of the employer, and to the extent that matters, it may or may not matter to the Trump or the federal government, whether the postal service is slowed down or not, is kind of one issue. But then, in terms of the legality, the issue I always run into is that, it's considered an illegal work action. And, to the extent that they can isolate it, they can, take action against individual workers or against the union. I think this is something that comes up probably more in the airline industry where, slowdowns actually theoretically could have like a big effect, and employers will run in and get an injunction against the union, like the American pilots for like $20 million against the union, back in the early 2000s, and are always threatening them on the flimsiest of margins. So I think that's one of the things that you run into with sort of a coordinated slowdown, and then you got to figure out to what extent it actually is really impacting and giving you leverage for your contract, which may or may not exist.
Awesome. Thank you.
Especially when they're doing the slowdown anyway, but by underfunding,
Yeah. All right. Up next, we have Vicky and then Ernest.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Vicky. I'm a retired letter carrier from San Francisco. I've been a union member for going on 52 years, NALC. I adore John Murphy. I'm sorry, I'm your fan, and I always praise you, and he knows that. Margot, I want to say I listened to the women's circle you had, and I want you to know that I passed at the National Convention, a 2-year paid maternity leave resolution, but nothing's happened. So we'll talk later about that. Joe Burns, you just gave an incredible, dense, it's full of so much information. I'm on overload. I totally agree with everything you said. I think the leadership is bankrupt. Well, if you have bankrupt union leaders conducting union meetings, how could it be interesting? How could anybody want to go to they know. And though, like you said, those workers that don't go to union meetings, I think they know why they don't go, because it's a waste of time, because they know their union leaders are bankrupt and have sold them out and are not fighting for them. I've heard it across the country in my own local. And San Francisco used to be one of the leading branches. Jamie can testify to that. And we've completely imploded. But the one thing that I feel like is missing from this conversation when you talk about class organizing is economics. It's all about the economy. It's all about the money. It is all about capitalism. And if you don't understand that capitalism is falling apart, it's breaking down, young people that aren't even in unions hate capitalism. And it's like we've got to somehow make the connection, because the only way capitalism can survive is if they exploit the workers. And we have to say the word. And I don't know if you did that intentionally. You don't want to you can't say that word. But I feel like the Democrats and Republicans are two capitalist parties. And I think we need like a participatory type of government like in Europe. When Macron of France, the president, stands next to a socialist leader, and they're like, it's not like a bad thing. It's like they have to work things out. They have socialist parties, they have communist parties, they have social democratic parties, they have all kinds of parties. But here we have to get over that. And one last thing, workers care. This is what I really believe. You need to understand that the postal workers are basically on the conservative side. When I first started, many of my co-workers were out of the military. That's very conservative, very conservative. But you push them to a certain point, because we all want the same thing. We want a roof over our head. We want food on the table. We want our kids to be happy, and we don't want to be harassed. Those are like basic human needs. And I believe that the right to strike is a human right. And when they realize this is in jeopardy, they are going to come forward. It's out of striking is always a last resort. It's always a last resort. And when we're facing an existential threat, there may not be a postal service coming. Like, who knows when he's going to declare no more post office. It's serious. And I think that this kind of conversation is absolutely critical. I've like Jamie said, I've never heard anybody discuss this ever. So thank you. This group of, what is it? Was it Next Generation Carriers? Or I don't know your acronym. Okay, I love you, John. I do. I'm sorry. He knows I love him. Anyways. So I just think we need to understand. Don't get frustrated, because those that don't want to go, they know it's bullshit. I know it's bullshit. My one friend said, look, people that go to the union meetings, you have some that can't go to union meetings at all. It's just not in them. And then you've got me and John and Jamie and Virgilio that are at this end, the opposite end. But everyone falls somewhere in between. And I have seen it. We had one strike vote back in the 70s, and we had to rent a hall at the Hilton, and you wouldn't believe how many people showed up. They showed up. We didn't talk about it for months or days or, whatever, because they somehow knew. They know. Don't underestimate workers. They fucking, excuse my French, they know. They know. Anyways, that's it. And, I just keep on going, man. I really love you all.
Awesome. Feel free to use all the plain language you need here. It's okay. We're expressive. There's a lot going on. It's okay. We're letter carriers, not librarians. Margaret, you wrote a comment. Do you want to just kind of address, because I think it was addressing what Jamie said. So if you want to, I'll unmute you so you can just answer that question.
Yes, so I wrote up a little thing really quickly here. I literally just spammed Jamie's inbox. Um, so I'll just read a little bit of what I have here. I said, to address Jamie's question, the right to strike resolution that passed in Branch 9 acknowledges that the official position of the NALC is already that we should have the right to strike. My answer, and this is just my answer, the other coordinating committee members can get on this if they feel differently. But my answer is that it's about reviving the discussion and forcing the debate within the union, and it's about going on offense rather than defense. Additionally, we discuss right to strike because we know that we have the legal right to discuss the right to strike, but we can't just call for a wildcat strike tomorrow. And I think that there's kind of an ongoing discussion within the right to strike campaign about whether we're fighting for the political capacity or just like calling for a wildcat strike. But I think the purpose of the political fight is to let the record show that we have exhausted every avenue legitimately before taking any sort of job action that could result in discipline. We have a really long way to go in terms of preparedness before we consider going there, and that's kind of why we're taking the approach that we are. Additionally, carriers are going into the next negotiation season looking for guidance and a cause to get behind, and we think that given the results of the last contract, the right to strike ties in really well with the contract campaign that we're launching. That's basically what I have to say about it. If anyone else feels, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for that. All right. That is part of an ongoing discussion. That's great. Ernest, I'll see you up next, brother. Let me unmute you. There you go. Oh, I think let me do it again. There you go. You're good.
Am I working? Can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, sweet. A couple of things, man. So I guess I'll start with me and Margot are both on the coordinating committee for Build a Fighting NALC. We have continued to have discussions around the right to strike and why it's important. I think I'm a little bit different than most people that are on the coordinating committee, not necessarily because I'm anything special, but just because I think I grew up or I live in a different circumstance than most of my other coordinating committee members. I live in South Texas, and I am a capitalist. For me, the reason why I agree with the rest of my colleagues that are on the coordinating committee is if you honestly believe in capitalism, you have to honestly then believe that workers have the right to walk away from a situation that they're not benefiting from if you honestly believe that capitalism is the system that's going to pave the way for an equal future. If you honestly believe that a competitive market, I'm getting feedback from somebody, so I don't know if that's somebody's not muted or whatever, but it would help
You're
if
good now.
everybody is. I appreciate it. So, and it's a very basic, it's a very simple structure. You know, capitalism is pretty simple in the sense that if you have a competitive market, the idea is that you have a system where the person who is the most creative or the person who is the most adventurous will be able to get you the most successful or the best product or service at the best price. The only way that that works is if you can't subjugate your workers. End of fucking story. Sorry for my French. Matter of fact, I think John put it in there earlier. So Vicky, I think got me in the mood. I apologize.
That's one
But
demerit. All right.
all right, we'll put a notch on mine. But you know, yeah. So this is coming from again somebody who is part of a this is coming from someone who is part of a red state, someone who, again, is a little bit different from most of my other colleagues who are on the coordinating committee, and how we have these nuanced discussions amongst people who are from different intellectual backgrounds. As far as some people believe in socialism, some people believe in maybe even communism, and some people of us are in the capitalistic ideologies. Secondly, I do want to thank Vicky. You know, there are a number of individuals who have reached out to me, regardless of what situation I find myself in. But there are individuals from their generation who have consistently looked at us and told us either that they're proud of us or they continue to thank us, saying that, you know, they look at us and say that for the most part, their generation completely forgot their obligation to the generation that was going to come after them. And for all of the trouble that has caused us, there are the Vickies of the world who continue to say, I didn't forget. I understand that in order for you guys to have a seat at the table, in order for you guys to understand that this is also yours when we are no longer here, we understand that it's our obligation to make sure that we are paving the way so that you have either a better existence than us or something that is just as fruitful. And I think that we have forgotten that as a society. I think it's one of the most detrimental parts of American economy. And it really does break my heart because I do have children. Most of my coordinated committee members don't, but it's one of the reasons why I continue to champion what the previous generation, the people who help us, people like Vicky, who continue to say that, hey, there are people, although that you guys may feel like our generation left you behind, there are still people within that generation who understand that they don't necessarily live their life only because you guys have less than us. And for that, I can't even begin to tell you how thankful I am. It's not said nearly enough. But I do want to make sure that you guys don't forget that we, from our generation, understand that that is so important. And we do appreciate that there are you guys that are around. Vicky, Jamie, people like Corey, Henry, Mike, you know, there are so many of you guys, and it really does touch my heart. Again, because I have children, and now I understand why it's so important to make sure that you're paying attention to the people that come after you. Voter apathy. I got into this issue with Mike, where I was trying to explain to on his podcast, where if you look at American demographics and you understand that if you break down American workers and you break down what their ideologies are and you break it down by income ladders, as you start from the bottom, the people who make the least amount of money have zero say so in the amount of or what type of legislation gets passed on Capitol Hill. As you go up the income ladder, their influence gets more and more prevalent. When you get to the top of the income ladder, the policy is made. The reason that I brought that up on that podcast was to say that at the same time that that is true, when you look at the NALC, we had just got into a situation where we had gotten rank and file letter carriers very interested into what is going to go into their working conditions with the contract. They voted it down, I think, at an average rate of 3-1. If you look at the tentative agreement and how many people voted it down versus how many people tried to get it passed. Once you look at it from that perspective and they pushed it through anyway, it's inevitable that you get your answer for voter apathy. People do not feel that this is worth their time. If you do not feel that me voting for this is going to have any shape one way or the other, why the hell would they engage? It's not a mystery in my opinion. Lastly, because I don't want to take up too much time, but Joe, this question is one thing that I want to pose to you, not necessarily to put anybody on blast, but to say, if the younger membership, who is unbelievably outnumbered, in my opinion, when it comes to political power within the NALC and within most political adversary or most political organizations within America, if we are unable to convince the rest of our colleagues that stepping away from whatever industry that they happen to participate in is viable, is our ability to say we are then going to protest or strike our own union. We are all going to decide en masse that we're not going to pay dues anymore. If you guys continue to have this idea that we're just going to stick around and pay dues when you guys do not represent us, is that something that could be fruitful, or is that something that could be effective, in your opinion, if the younger generation is unable to convince everybody else that striking from the actual economy is fruitful? Just stepping away from their union and causing, even if it's just 20, 30, 40% of the members of a particular union to stop paying dues. How do you feel that that tactic would work?
Yeah, it comes up, people get frustrated, you try and push for change, and then, the idea is, well, let's just pull out, but I'm not in favor of that, and I really never am. I just think that, you have to win people over to the idea, and to have it be successful, you're going to have to win them over anyway. You can't just have like a young person strike anyway. So you gotta work on it. And I wouldn't give up on the fact that I wouldn't assume that people don't care, or won't care, or can't care. You can win them over. The problem is when a chunk of people end up absent themselves from the union, then you just leave the union to those that are left. But the union is still kind of determining your future, and it doesn't, take away their ability. It may cause them some temporary inconvenience, but it just basically gets you all out of their hair. So I just think that, the best thing is to kind of regroup and figure out how you win more people over. But I think as a general rule, it's never a good idea to pull out of the union or counsel others to pull out of the union, because you're just leaving it to the hacks.
Cool. Thank you. One of the things that we lack inside the NALC is labor history, and I think that's one of the reasons why you see people like, I'm just gonna get out of the union. And we saw it recently with the rural carriers. They tried to do a petition a year ago to decertify the rural carriers union and try to link up with the Teamsters. But Teamsters union has a no rating language, and it's also in their contract. For anyone that's listening that actually wants to learn history and tactics, I would recommend the audiobook. It's 6 hours long. We kind of mentioned it earlier. Red State Revolt by Eric Black. It talks about the most recent strikes that happened across the country, from the right to work states during Trump. Trump was president, and these strikes were illegal. The teachers went out and they won. And it happened not in the blue states or the progressive states. It happened in the red states. And then the other thing I want to hear Joe Burns kind of conclude on for wrapping up is Teamsters for a Democratic Union. One of the best films I've seen is the Diana Kilmary story. It's a TV movie from the 1990s. You can find it on YouTube for free. I would recommend people watch it. It's 90 minutes long. It's about the rank and file members inside the union uniting to take back their union. It's a very educational movie. It talks about how we can unite and take back. So, Joe, for all the young folks that are listening and the older folks that are actually cautious about trying to revive our union, can you speak on TDU and reform movements, if they are a good thing or a bad thing, and if they're successful or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a long history of folks building reform movements to try and change their unions and to having a significant impact. In TDU, I was a TDU intern in 1986 and lived in the labor notes office in this little apartment. So I have a long history with them. But they started off in the 70s, and I've had a lot of accomplishments over the years. The UPS strike, people may remember the UPS strike of 1996. It's a large part because of TDU's efforts in helping get Ron Carey, who was a great reformer, elected. They've backed Sean O'Brien, which is a bit of a mixed bag in my opinion now. But I think the auto workers, the UAWD, helping get Sean Fain elected, directly leading to some strikes. So I think the sort of organized reform efforts is a strong part of any class struggle unionism, and is really a core about a lot of what we need to be doing in a lot of situations. So I know I got to get rolling, but I thank you all for the conversation, and I'm glad I was able to have this discussion with y'all, and definitely let's keep in touch.
Thank you. Solidarity, Joe. Thank you.
All right, take
Thank
care.
you very
everybody.
much.
See
All
ya.
right. Thank you, everyone who listened and watched us live on Facebook. Appreciate it. So thanks for being here. Yeah. All right. So, okay, good. Now we can start swearing. Oh, wait, let me shut the feed, then we can start at the F-bomb. So,
You got shot Facebook.
all right. There we go.